Hi there, welcome to Fantasy Hub. I'm Mia, your storyteller. Today's story is filled with heartache, discovery, and a twist you won't see coming. So let's begin.
At 43 years old, Nora Rodriguez sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair of Dr. Miranda Chun's office, her hands folded tightly in her lap like two birds seeking shelter from a storm. The divorce papers in her purse still carried the scent of her attorney's cologne, a bitter reminder that 15 years of marriage had crumbled to dust in just 6 months of legal proceedings. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead with that particular frequency that seems to burrow into one's soul, casting everything in harsh, unforgiving shadows. Nora's reflection in the window showed a woman she barely recognized anymore, hollow cheeks where once there had been full roundness of contentment, eyes that had forgotten how to sparkle, hair that hung limp despite her morning efforts to tame it into something resembling her former self. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Dr. Chun began, her voice carrying the practiced gentleness of someone who has delivered countless pieces of devastating news. The manila folder in her hand seemed to weigh more than mountains. "I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you will change everything." How strange it is, the old narrator's voice interjects with infinite compassion, that life chooses to pile its heaviest burdens upon us when we are already bent nearly to breaking. As if the universe tests not our strength, but our capacity to find light in the deepest darkness. Nora's fingers found the small silver locket at her throat, a gift from her grandmother, the only family heirloom she had fought for in the divorce. Inside was a photo of herself at 7 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, standing next to an empty space where once, she swore, her imaginary friend Lily used to play. "BMRI results," Dr. Chun continued, sliding the images across the desk like tarot cards revealing an unwelcome future. "Show a mass in your brain. Glioblastoma. Stage 4. The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Nora heard them, understood their meaning, but felt somehow disconnected from their reality. It was as if she were watching someone else receive this news, someone else whose world was collapsing like a house of cards in a gentle breeze. "How long?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Dr. Chun's pause lasted exactly 3 heartbeats. Nora counted them. "With aggressive vitriol, we're looking at 12 to 18 months. Without it. She didn't need to finish. In that moment, the narrator's voice grows softer. Something extraordinary happened. Not the miraculous kind that ends stories in perfect happiness, but the quiet kind that changes everything. Nora Rodriguez, who had spent 43 years living the life others expected of her, felt something ancient and powerful stir within her chest. It was not acceptance. No, that would come later. It was something far more dangerous and beautiful, the recognition that she had never truly lived. Asterisk. The weeks that followed moved like honey poured in winter, thick, slow, each moment heavy with the weight of newfound mortality. Nora's cramped apartment, hastily rented after the divorce, became both sanctuary and prison. The walls, painted in what the landlord uptistily called sunset beige, seemed to close in each evening as the chemotherapy drugs coursed through her system like liquid fire. But it was on the third Thursday after her diagnosis, as autumn painted Chicago in shades of amber and gold, that Nora rediscovered her piano. She had seen it in the window of Henderson's music shop, a battered upright with keys that had yellowed like old teeth, that somehow still called to her with a voice of her childhood. The shopkeeper, a bent old man with eyes like dewdrops, had agreed to deliver it for half the asking price when she explained her situation with the simple words, "I don't have much time left to make music." "There is something sacred," the narrator observes with the wisdom of ages, "about returning to things that once made us feel most alive. It is as if our souls remember what our minds have forgotten, that we are more than the sum of our fears, more than the weight of our sorrows." Fingers, stiff from weeks of medical procedures, found the keys like a bird returning to its nest after a long, cold winter. The music that flowed from her was not the careful composition she had once performed in high school recitals, but something raw and honest, the sound of a heart learning to sing again in the face of its own ending. It was this music that brought Dr. Trinity Perry into her life. Asterisk. The oncology ward at Northwestern Memorial Hospital possessed all the sterile efficiency one might expect, but Trinity Perry moved through its corridors like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had stared death in the face so many times it had become not an enemy, but a familiar dance partner. Nora first noticed her hands. surgeon's hands, precise and gentle, with fingers that looked as though they could coax music from silence or life from shadow. She wore no wedding ring, only a simple silver band on her right thumb that caught the light as she reviewed Nora's chart with intensity of someone reading sacred scripture. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Dr. Perry said, settling into the chair beside Nora's. "Treatment bed with fluid grace. I'd like to discuss your care plan. But first I have to ask, do you play piano?" The question caught Nora so off guard that she nearly laughed, the sound escaping like a bird freed from a cage. "How could you possibly know that?" Trinity smiled, and it was like watching dawn break. "Over calm water, your fingers, even relaxed, they curve as if they're resting on keys. My grandmother was a pianist," I recognized the posture. Love, the narrator reflects with gentle knowing, rarely announces itself with trumpets and fanfare. More often, it arrives in the space between one breath and the next, in the recognition of something in another person that calls to the deepest part of ourselves. They talked for 47 minutes that day, 17 minutes longer than scheduled. Trinity spoke of her grandmother's hands dancing across ivory keys in a small apartment in Brooklyn, of how music had been her lullaby and her morning prayer. Nora found herself sharing stories she hadn't told in years, of the upright piano in her childhood home, of songs composed in secret and performed for an audience of dusty sunbeams and one imaginary friend with silver hair and eyes like starlight. Trinity finally rose to leave. She paused at the threshold. "Mrs. Rodriguez, Nora, won't you play for me sometime?" It was not a request, but an invitation to something neither of them fully understood yet. Asterisk, the next months passed in a rhythm as complex and beautiful as any symphony. 3 times a week, Nora would receive her treatments, and 3 times a week, Trinity would find reasons to spend extra time reviewing her case. Their conversations meandered through topics as varied as the weather and as profound as the nature of existence itself. Trinity spoke of her path to oncology, of how watching her grandfather's battle with leukemia had awakened in her a fierce determination to be a warrior against the darkness that sought to claim lives before their stories were finished. Nora shared her own awakening, how the diagnosis had not been an ending, but a beginning. The first honest moment of a life spent meeting everyone else's expectations. It is a curious thing. The narrator muses how the shadow of death often teaches us, finally, how to live. As if mortality were not a curse, but a gift. The knowledge that our time is precious, making each moment shine like a jewel held up to candlelight. Their first touch was accidental. Trinity checking Nora's pulse after a particularly difficult treatment session, her fingers lingering just a heartbeat longer than strictly necessary against Nora's wrist. The contact sent electricity through both women, a recognition that felt older than words. The first intentional touch came 3 weeks later, when Nora played Chopin's Nocturne in I-flat major on the old upright in her apartment, while Trinity sat on the threadbare couch, her eyes closed, tears tracking silver paths down her cheeks. When the last notes faded into silence, Trinity's hand found Nora's, their fingers intertwining like roots of ancient trees growing together in secret darkness. "This is complicated," Trinity whispered, her voice carrying all the weight of professional ethics and personal longing. "Everything worthwhile is," Nora replied, turning her hands so their palms pressed together, heartline against heartline. The kiss that followed was gentle as morning rain, full of unspoken promises and the bittersweet knowledge that their time was measured not in years but in treatments, not in seasons but in the slow, steady countdown of Nora's prognosis. Love in the face of loss, the narrator observes with infinite gentleness, burns brighter than love burned in safety. It is a flame that consumes even as it illuminates, beautiful precisely because it knows itself to be temporary. It was on a Tuesday in March, when the last stubborn patches of snow clung to Chicago sidewalks like memories refusing to fade, that Lily returned. Nora had been sitting at her piano, working through a piece she was composing, something that had started as a lullaby but had grown into something far more complex. A musical love letter to Trinity, to life, to the strange beauty of finding joy in sorrow. Her reflection in the window showed the toll the treatments were taking, the scarf wrapped around her head where thick auburn hair had once cascaded, the new hollows in her cheeks, the way her clothes hung loose in a frame that seemed to be returning to air and light. But when she looked up from the keys, her reflection was not alone. Standing beside her in the window's surface was a figure from her childhood, tall and willowy, with silver hair that seemed to move in winds no one else could feel, and eyes the color of starlight. Lily looked exactly as she had 36 years ago, When 7-year-old Nora had declared her imaginary friend too childish and banished her to the realm of forgotten things, the veil between worlds. The narrator's voice carries ancient knowing, prose thin and time's off-great transformation. When the soul stands at the crossroads between one existence and the next, sometimes, sometimes the impossible becomes merely improbable. Hello, Nora, Lily said, her voice like music heard from a great distance. I've been waiting for you to need me again. Nora's hands stilled on the keys. In anyone else's life, this moment might have been cause for psychiatric evaluation, a symptom of the tumor's growth, or the medication's side effects. But Nora had spent these months learning to trust the wisdom that lives beneath the surface operational thought. You're not supposed to be here, she said quietly. I'm not 7 anymore. Lily's smile was sad and knowing, the expression of someone who has seen countless stories end and begin again. You're dying, dear one. The rules that govern ordinary life don't apply to souls preparing to cross over. The words should have been frightening, but instead, Nora felt a strange peace settle over her like a warm blanket. Is that what you're here for? To help me ... cross over? Not cross over, Lily said, stepping forward until she stood directly behind Nora, her hands resting on shoulders that suddenly felt less burdened. To show you that crossing over might not be necessary. Asterisk that night, as Trinity slept curled against her side in the narrow bed, Nora listened to Lily's impossible tale. Her childhood friend spoke of dimensions layered like sheets of tissue paper, of versions of reality where different choices had been made, where different outcomes were possible. She spoke of love as a force that could bridge not just hearts but entire worlds, and off music as the language that could make such bridges sing. In one dimension over, Lily explained, her form flickering slightly in the darkness, you never married Michael. You became a pianist, traveled the world, never developed the tumor. In another, Trinity was born in your hometown, and you met in high school. There are versions of reality where your love story has decades to unfold, where your fingers never forget the feeling off keys beneath them. The human mind, the narrator notes with gentle wonder, struggles to comprehend infinity. We think in terms of beginnings and endings, of lines drawn from birth to death. But what if existence were not a line but a web, not a single thread but a tapestry of infinite complexity? How? Nora whispered, careful not to wake the woman whose breath warmed her shoulder. The music you've been composing, Lily said. It's not just a song, Nora, it's a key. Love, true, deep, transformative love, creates resonances that can reach across dimensional boundaries. Your love for Trinity, combined with the musical frequency you've been developing, could open a doorway. The absurdity of it should have made Nora laugh. Instead, she felt something deep in her chest respond to Lily's words, like a tuning fork struck by the precise note. The piece she had been working on, it did feel like something beyond mere composition, something that seemed to write itself through her fingers, as if she were merely the vessel for music that originated elsewhere. What would happen to this Trinity? Nora asked, the one here with me now. Lily's expression grew infinitely compassionate. Love doesn't abandon Nora, it transforms. She would remember this version of your story like a beautiful dream, but she would also know, somehow, that it was leading to something greater. Trinity stirred in her sleep, murmuring Nora's name, her arm tightening unconsciously around her waist. The gesture was so tender, so protective, that Nora felt tears slide down her cheeks like silver rivers. This, she thought, is the cruelest gift of all, to be offered hope when I finally learned to live with hopelessness. Asterisk. The conversation took place the following evening in Trinity's apartment, a space that reflected its owner's soul, warm wood surfaces covered with medical journals and sheet music, plants that thrived despite their owner's unpredictable schedule, and photographs that told stories of a life lived with quiet intensity. Nora had not planned to tell her about Lily, about the impossible possibility that had been laid before her like a hand of cards in a cosmic game. But as they sat together on Trinity's couch, sharing takeout Chinese food and companionable silence, the weight of the secret became more unbearable. There's something I need to tell you, Nora began, setting down her chopsticks. Something that's going to sound impossible. Trinity's green eyes, the color of deep forest shadows, focused on her with the attention usually reserved for life and death medical decisions. Okay, Nora told her everything, about Lily's return, about the dimensions laid out like books on an infinite shelf, about the music that might be more than music. She watched Trinity's face carefully, expecting skepticism, disbelief. perhaps concern for her mental state. Instead, Trinity was quiet for a long moment after Nora finished speaking. When she finally responded, her voice was thoughtful rather than dismissive. I became a doctor because I believe in fighting for life, she said slowly. But I've seen and I'm gonna explain recoveries, enough moments that defy medical science to know that there are forces at work in this universe that textbooks can't explain. Wisdom, the narrator reflects, is not the absence of doubt, but the courage to act in spite of it. Some souls are born with the ability to recognize truth, even when it arrives in impossible packs. Trinity reached for Nora's hands, holding them gently in her own. If there's a chance, even the smallest, most impossible chance, then we have to take it. Not just for you, but for us, for the love we found. The ritual Lily described was simple in its complexity. Nora would need to play the complitem composing at midnight on the night of the new moon, with Trinity as witness and anchor. The music would create a resonance, a vibrational bridge between realities, and if their love was strong enough, if the dimensional walls were thin enough, the crossing might be possible. Simple words, the narrator notes, to describe an act that would require them to bet everything in love's ability to transcend the very laws of physics. What if it doesn't work? Trinity asked. Then I die knowing I was loved completely by someone extraordinary, Nora replied. And you'll know that our love was worth risking everything for. Trinity's kiss tasted of tears and hope, of endings and beginnings wound together like threads in a tapestry too complex for human eyes to fully comprehend. The new moon rose invisible in the Chicago sky, its absence creating a darkness that seemed to topple us with possibility. Nora's apartment had been transformed by candlelight and intention. Trinity had brought white roses from her grandmother's garden, and Lily had suggested placing crystals, borrowed from Trinity's surprisingly metaphysical roommate, around the piano in patterns that seemed to hum with their own energy. Nora sat at the bench, her fingers poised above the keys that had become extensions of her soul over these past months. The composition was complete, 17 pages of music that felt less written than channeled, notes that seemed to contain entire conversations between her heart and something vast and loving that lived beyond the boundaries of ordinary existence. Trinity sat in the chair closest to the piano, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes bright with unshed tears and determination. She wore the silver bracelet Nora had given her for her birthday, a simple thing, but engraved with the opening notes of the piece Nora was about to play. Are you ready? Lily asked, her form more solid than Nora had ever seen it, as if the approaching ritual were lending her substance. In moments of greatest transformation, the narrator observes with infinite gentleness, time seems to slow and expand, allowing the soul to memorize everything, the quality of light, their rhythm of breathing, the way love feels when it's about to be tested by forces beyond human understanding. Nora nodded, her throat too tight with emotion for words. Her fingers found the first chord, and the music began. The melody that flowed from the old upright piano was unlike anything she had played before. It started soft and questioning, like a prayer whispered in darkness, then grew in complexity and power. The notes seemed to take on physical weight, filling the apartment with vibrations that made the candle flames dance and the crystals chime softly in harmony. As she played, Nora felt something extraordinary happening. The walls of the apartment began to grow transparent, revealing layers of reality stacked like sheets of glass. She could see other versions of this moment, versions where she was older, younger, where Trinity had different colored hair, where they stood in different rooms, in different cities, in different lives entirely. The music reached its crescendo, and suddenly the air itself seemed to split, revealing a doorway made of pure sound and light. Through it, Nora could see another apartment, and a third piano, another version of herself and Trinity, embracing in a world where no tumor clouded their future, where love had room to grow and flourish over decades rather than months. This, the narrator breathes with wonder, is the moment when the impossible reveals itself to be simply another kind of possible, when love proves itself stronger than the laws that govern ordinary existence. Now, Nora, Lily called, her voice carrying the urgency of cosmic timing. The door won't stay open long. Nora's hands never faltered on the keys, even as she felt herself being pulled toward the shimmering portal. But instead of moving forward immediately, she turned to look at Trinity one last time. Come with me, she said, her voice carrying over the music that had become a living thing in the room around them. Trinity rose from her chair, her face radiant with tears and joy and the kind of love that makes the universe reorganize itself in. Wonder, anywhere, she said simply, always. Together, hand in hand, they stepped into the light that love had created, into a dimension where their story was just beginning rather than ending, into a reality where time was measured not in treatments, but in anniversaries. Not in farewells, but in morning kisses and shared dreams and the thousand small miracles of growing old together. The music followed them across the dimensional threshold, becoming the soundtrack to their new beginning, the theme song of love triumphant over mortality, of hope rewarded by courage, of two souls who refused to accept that their story had to end just because one world said it must. Asterisk, and so. The old narrator concludes, his voice soft with wonder and satisfaction. Nora Rodriguez learned what mystics and lovers have always known, that love is not bound by the small rules that govern ordinary existence. In this dimension, Trinity Perry continues her work as a healer, but now she comes home each evening to the sound of piano music drifting from their sunlit apartment, to a woman whose hair has grown back silver and beautiful, whose hands create melodies that seem to contain entire worlds. Sometimes, late at night, Trinity thinks she remembers another version of their love story, one shut out by loss and bounded by time. But then Nora calls her to come listen to a new composition, and the memory fades like a dream, replaced by the reality of their infinite present. For love, you see, is the only force in any universe that can rewrite the rules of existence itself. Itis, the composer of impossible symphonies, the architect of miraculous bridges, the author of stories that refuse to end simply because someone, somewhere, decided they must. In every dimension, in every possible reality, love finds a way. And Nora and Trinity's love, born in the sterile corridors of a hospital, nurtured in the shadow of death, tested by the ultimate boundary between one existence and another, proved itself worthy of miracles. Their piano still sits by the window of an apartment in Chicago, but now it plays melodies that echo across multiple realities. Songs that remind anyone who hears them that no love story ever truly ends. It simply transforms, finding new ways to sing itself into existence, new dimensions in which to bloom and flourish and become the force that holds entire universes together. This is the truth that only old souls and great lovers know, that love is not subject to time, not limited by space, not conquered by death itself. It is the one constant in an infinite cosmos of variables, the one song that plays in every reality, the one force that can turn impossible into inevitable, with nothing more than the courage to believe. And so their story continues. In this dimension and countless others, a love letter written in music and starlight, in medical miracles and metaphysical possibilities, in the simple truth that some souls are meant to find each other regardless of what worlds they must cross, what rules they must break, what impossibilities they must make possible in order to be together. Remember this, dear ones, when the world tells you that love must end, that death must win, that impossible means never. Remember Nora and Trinity, and know that love, true, deep, transformative love, is always writing new stories, always finding new ways to prove that forever is not just a promise lovers make, but a truth written into the very fabric of existence. Asterisk, but the story, the narrator continues with a gentle chuckle that carries the warmth of autumn fires, does not end simply because lovers have found their happiness. For love, once awakened into its true power, sends ripples across the fabric of existence like stones cast into still water. In the weeks that followed their crossing, Trinity began to notice changes in her patients that defied medical explanation. Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman with pancreatic cancer who had been given days to live, suddenly began responding to treatments with remarkable vigor. Young Marcus Williams, barely 21 with leukemia that had resisted every therapy, started showing signs of remission that made his oncology team gather in hushed conferences, speaking in whispers of miracles they couldn't name. It was Dr. Sarah Martinez, Trinity's closest colleague and friend, who first made the connection. "Trinity," she said one evening as they reviewed charts in the break room, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone approaching a delicate subject, "have you noticed that your success rate has changed recently?" Trinity looked up from Marcus's latest blood work, numbers that told a story of healing that would have been impossible. "What do you mean?" "I mean patients who should be dying are getting better. And it's not just one or two cases, it's happening across your entire roster." Sarah's dark eyes held a mixture of wonder and concern. The other doctors are starting to talk. There are those, the narrator observes with ancient knowing, who believe that love exists in isolation, that its effects are contained within the hearts it touches directly. But love, like music, like light itself, operates on frequencies that reach far beyond their immediate source. Trinity felt something stir in her chest, a recognition she couldn't quite name. That evening, she sat at the piano in their apartment, her fingers finding melodies that seemed to flow from the same source as Nora's compositions. As she played, she began to understand something profound. Their crossing between dimensions hadn't just saved Nora's life. It had torn a small hole in the wall between what was possible and what was necessary, and that hole was allowing healing to flow through in ways that touched everyone around them. "You're different," Nora said, settling beside her on the bench. In this dimension, her hair had indeed grown back silver, creating a crown of starlight around her face that made her look like some ancient goddess of wisdom and love. "Since we crossed over, there's something in your deck now that wasn't there before." Trinity's hand stilled on the keys. "I think I'm healing people in ways I don't understand. Not just with medicine, but with something else. Something that came from what we did." This, the narrator explains with gentle reverence, is how love transforms not just lovers, but the very world around them. When two souls prove that the impossible is merely another kind of possible, they create pathways for other miracles to follow. It was Lily who appeared to them 3 months later, materializing in their kitchen on a Tuesday morning as they shared coffee and the newspaper, looking exactly as ethereal and wise as she had during the crossing ritual. "You've started something," she said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Thema as if she had always belonged there. "The resonance you created, it's still reverberating across dimensional boundaries." Nora set down her coffee cup carefully. "What kind of something?" Lily's smile was mysterious, full of secrets that stretched across infinite realities. "Other souls are starting to hear the music you composed. Other lovers facing impossible odds are beginning to understand that love might be stronger than the circumstances that would tear them apart." She waved her hand, and the air above the kitchen table shimmered like heat waves, showing them glimpses of other stories beginning to unfold. A young man in Tokyo whose partner was battling a rare neurological disease, sitting at a keyboard as tears streamed down his face, his fingers finding notes that sounded remarkably similar to Nora's composition. A woman in Sao Paulo holding her girlfriend's hand in a hospital room, humming a melody she couldn't remember learning, while monitors showed impossible improvement in brain activity. An elderly couple in Maine, married for 57 years, dancing slowly in their living room to music that seemed to play from the walls themselves, as the Alzheimer's that had been stealing their memories began, inexplicably, to retreat. "Love," Willie explained, "has always been the most powerful force in any universe. But most souls never learn how to access its true potential. You too, by refusing to accept that your story had to end, by literally rewriting the rules of existence. Through the power of your connection, you've created a blueprint that other lovers can follow." And so, the narrator continues with deep satisfaction, we begin to understand the true scope of what Nora and Trinity accomplished. They had not simply saved themselves, but had become lighthouse keepers of possibility, their love a beacon guiding other souls through the darkness toward their own miraculous transformations. Trinity reached for Nora's hand across the table, their fingers intertwining with the practice CDs of souls who had chosen each other across multiple realities. "What do we do with this responsibility?" "You teach," Lily said simply. "You show others what you've learned. Not everyone will have the ability to cross dimensions. That requires a very specific kind of love and a very particular set of circumstances. But everyone can learn to harness love's healing power, to use it to create miracles within their own reality." Asterisk, the Aurora Institute for Healing Arts opened 18 months later in a renovated brownstone in Chicago's North Side. Its name inspired by the way light seemed to dance differently in rooms where love was consciously practiced. Trinity had resigned from her position at Northwestern Memorial, not because she no longer wished to heal, but because she had discovered a way to heal that went far beyond conventional medicine. The Institute's mission statement, written in Nora's elegant script and framed in the lobby, read simply, "Love is the frequency at which miracles naturally occur. We are here to help you find your note." Their first students were the skeptical and the desperate people who had exhausted conventional treatments and were willing to try something that sounded impossible because impossible was all they had left. Dr. James Harrison, a cardiologist whose own heart disease had progressed despite every intervention known to medical science. Linda Waters, a nurse whose daughter had been in a coma for 8 months following a car accident. Roberto Martinez, a musician whose progressive hearing loss threatened to end the career that gave his life meaning. What they found, the narrator shares with the warmth of someone recounting cherished memories, was not magic in the way fairy tales describe it, with wands and spells and transformations that happen in the blink of an eye. What they found was something far more profound, the magic that lives within love itself when it is consciously directed, deliberate, telecultive, and fearlessly applied. The curriculum was unlike anything taught in traditional medical or music schools. Mornings begin with meditation designed to attune students to the frequencies of their own hearts. Trinity taught classes on the science of love, how oxytocin and other neurochemicals create pathways for healing that conventional medicine was only beginning to understand. How quantum physics suggested that consciousness itself might be the fundamental building block of reality. Nora's classes were pure magic. She would sit at her piano, the same old upright that had carried them between dimensions, now polished to a warm glow, and surrounded by cushions where students could sit close enough to feel the vibrations in their bones and teach them to compose their own healing songs. Every love story, she would tell them, has its own unique frequency. The love between parent and child sounds different from the love between partners, which sounds different from the love we'll feel for our own souls. But all love, at its core, is music. And music, when played with intention and received with openness, has the power to reorganize reality itself. Students learn to listen, the narrator continues with gentle pride, not just with their ears, but with their entire beings. They learned that healing was not something done to them by doctors or medications, but something that arose from the alignment between their deepest truth and their highest possibility. Asterisk, the first documented healing happened 6 weeks into the Institute's inaugural semester. Dr. Harrison, who had been attending classes with the resignation of someone who had treated everything else, experienced what his cardiologist later described as the most remarkable recovery I've witnessed in 30 years of practice. It had happened during one of Nora's composition classes. Dr. Harrison had been working on a piece inspired by his love for his late wife, Margaret, who had died 2 years earlier from some genetic heart condition that now threatened his life. As his unpracticed fingers found the melody that expressed 43 years of shared mornings and whispered goodnights, something shifted in his chest, not the familiar pain he had grown accustomed to, but something warm and expansive like sunlight breaking through clouds. The change was visible on the EKG monitor Trinity had insisted on keeping in the classroom. The irregular rhythms that had defined Dr. Harrison's heart function for months suddenly smoothed into the steady, strong pattern of a healthy organ. His chest pain, which had been a constant companion, simply vanished. I felt Margaret with me, he told the class later, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. Not as a memory, but as a presence. And I understood something I'd never realized before. Love doesn't end when someone dies, it transforms. And sometimes, if we're paying attention, that transformation can heal us in ways that nothing else can. Such is the nature of true healing, the narrator explains with infinite compassion. It addresses not merely symptoms but causes, not just the body, but the soul's deepest wounds. Love, when consciously applied, doesn't simply cure, it makes whole. Linda Waters' breakthrough came during a meditation session where students were taught to extend their consciousness beyond the boundaries of their physical bodies. As she sat in the circle, breathing slowly and following Trinity's guided instructions, Linda felt herself traveling, not through space, but through the love that connected her to her daughter. She found herself standing beside Emily's hospital bed, not physically, but in some dimension where love makes all distances meaningless. In that space, she began to speak to her daughter not with words, but with the language of pure love, telling her how much she was needed, how beautiful the world would be when she returned to it, how many adventures still waited for them to share. Emily opened her eyes for the first time in 8 months. 3 days later, Roberto's healing was perhaps the most poetic of all. As his hearing continued to fade, he had begun to despair that music, the passion that had given his life meaning, would be lost to him forever. But in Nora's classes, he discovered something extraordinary, that music existed not just as sound, but as vibration, as energy, as a living force that could be felt through the body even when it could no longer be heard. Working with Nora, he learned to compose through touch rather than sound, feeling thigh vibrations of piano keys through his fingertips, sensing rhythm through the movement of his chest, understanding harmony through the way different frequencies made his bones resonate. The music he created this way was unlike anything he had composed before, deeper, more soulful, as if losing one sense had opened doors to others he never knew existed. 6 months after beginning his studies at the Institute, Roberto's hearing began to return, not completely, but enough that he could once again hear the music he created through touch and vibration. More remarkably, his new compositions, born from the marriage of loss and discovery, began to have healing effects on others who heard them. As if love and creativity had combined to create a new form of medicine, this, the narrator reflects with deep satisfaction, is how love multiplies itself, not through division, but through inspiration. Each soul that learns to access love's healing power becomes a anchor for others, creating an ever-expanding web of possibility that touches lives in ways that cannot be measured but only felt.